Call Stuart Nash.
Mr Speaker, whenever I hear John Biscown speak, the first thing he says is, I wasn't going to take a call on this bill, but I've changed my mind. I think it would be better for most in the House. Maybe you should go with your first call on that one. But what I do say, Mr Speaker, is I've heard Mr Biscown talk about the ETS numerous times now. Now, I'm going to put a challenge to him. How about that member puts his money where his mouth is? Is he still going to vote with a government that is going to implement an ETS? This member has spent many, many hours of his time researching, debating the ETS, but what is he going to do about it? When push comes to shove, will he put his money where his mouth is? So back to this bill. What this bill does is it I'm supporting this bill. I'm supporting this bill for very good reason. What this bill does, Mr Speaker, is it repeals a 1938 bill. And as I talked about in committee stage, imagine the time back then. Imagine the time back in 1938. What days they were then. They were hard days because this country was in the grip of a depression. They were tough days. They were dreadful days. And so imagine the foresight and the vision of a government that said, amongst all this misery, what we need is a beacon of light. What we need is a project that is going to inspire the people of New Zealand. What we're going to do is we're going to commission a bill that builds an observatory up there like a beacon for the whole country. So this bill went through in 1938, the bill that we were repealing. It took a few years to build, and it was commissioned in 1941. Now I can imagine, because they were dark days as well, of course. It was the middle of the Second World War. Things weren't going that well for the Allies. It was Stalingrad. They'd been kicked out of Dunkirk. The Germans were on the rampage. So it was dark days indeed for New Zealand. And here we were, this new observatory being commissioned. And I can just picture the imagery around this. This was an edifice that would have conveyed the image of looking forward, looking to the stars, looking onwards and looking upwards. This was a great symbol of where the country needed to go. It was truly aspirational, as only Labour parties and Labour governments can be. This was aspirational. It was opened, no doubt, by Peter Fraser. He would have been surrounded by the great men and women of the Labour Party that drew this country out of the depression it was in, created that social service net. Walter Nash was in Washington. He was the first overseas ambassador. He would have been there if he could have been there. But this was really an uplifting project, and it was fantastic. And I take my hat off to that visionary Labour government. I take my hat off to that government because, goodness me, they achieved so much in so little time. Then, of course, in 1977, Mr Speaker, it became our National Observatory. But this bill is the natural conclusion to a process that has been going on for quite a while now. In 2006, the Labour government gave $2.2 million to provide for more educational and tourist opportunities. In 2008, further funds followed to again increase the tourism opportunities. And now, with this bill, it is the official transformation from science to tourism. That is now complete. And I'll tell you what, Mr Speaker, in my 3 periods in this city, one as a student, second as a contractor, and now the third period as a Member of Parliament in this wonderful House, each time I walked past that observatory, every time I went to work or bus, and I looked up at it, and again, like I said, it spoke as a beacon of what the Labour government in 1938 achieved, looking onwards and upwards always. And now I come to this century, now I come to this time, and in a way maybe what is happening tonight is an analogy for the R&D in the science sector and funding in New Zealand under this government, and it saddens me. Mr Speaker, members of the House, we all know that Labour set up a $700 million fund, a $700 million fast-forward fund, because Labour understood that the only way this country was going to grow and compete in the globalised world of research and development and fast-paced movement, it needed research and development, and it needed a fund. It needed a way to help these businesses that were going to be the future face of this country. What happened? What happened? Those chaps were elected and the fund was ripped away, gutted. Now, we talk about the brain drain. There goes all the scientists that were going to work, that this money was going to be spent on. And my colleague, the Honourable Pete Hodgson, tells a story of a young scientist that came to Parliament to pick up a scholarship. And he was headed overseas to do his postdoc work. And he said to Pete, he said, you know, with this fund, Minister, with this fund, I am really tempted to come back to New Zealand now and work in New Zealand because I can now see a future for me as a scientist. I can see a future for research and development. This is the way forward. There is a future for me in this country. I wonder where he is now. He's probably at Cambridge or Oxford or MIT or Harvard. But one thing for sure, I very much doubt he's here. Well, we know that the first funding, that government's replacement for the Fast Forward Fund was only allocated, I believe, today.
Not even allocated.
Not even allocated, just announced. So they ripped $700 million out of the research and development sector, and what did they replace it with? 190 million primary growth partnership. 190 million. And it took them 18 months. 18 months. It's a disgrace. Now let me tell you, I'll tell you an interesting story. I was in a tax debate. I was in a tax debate in this house just a couple of days ago, last week, whenever it was, and one of my colleagues threw a question across the House. They said, what is in this budget that is going to drive research and development? What is in this budget to drive innovation? And do you know what the Minister of Research and Development said?
Nothing.
Tax cuts. He said tax cuts. I could not believe this. The Minister of Research and Development said tax cuts. Now, I expected him to yell across the floor, what we are going to do is we are going to activate the productive economy in this country by providing funding to the research and development sector. And he was going to be a lone voice amongst his colleagues because, of course, he has his PhD. The Minister has his PhD. Dr. Smith has a PhD. He understands the value of science. He understands the value of innovation and research because there are two ministers across the gallery at the moment that have their PhDs. Did they stand up in the cabinet meeting and say, we need more money to grow the productive economy and the only way we're going to do this is through research and development and innovation? Did they? No, they didn't. I thought they might have. But the reason I know they didn't is because the minister said the way to grow the productive economy is through tax cuts. And I could see my colleague David Shearer, who's done a lot of work on this and a lot of research, and he knows what every country around the world is doing this. I saw his shoulders drop. It dropped because Dr. Wayne Mack was an ally of his.
I was crying.
David Shearer said to me, Wayne Mack will stand up for our sector. I know he will because he's got a PhD. He understands this. David slumped back in his chair, his shoulders dropped because he knew the one person he thought he could rely on had let him down. Tax cuts were going to save this economy. Well, God help this economy if that's the way it is. That's all I can say. Because it was hugely frustrating, no doubt, for everyone who operates in the productive economy that needs just a little bit of incentive to drive growth, just a little bit of funding, a little bit of support from the government to drive innovation, to drive research and development so they can take their products globally, so we can start competing in the global environment. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, this analogy is saddening. But perhaps, Mr. Speaker, under this government, our economy will also move from one of scientific endeavour to purely tourism. That's why I say perhaps this bill tonight, where the Carter Observatory has moved from science to tourism, let's hope it's not, but I'm fearful that in fact this bill is an analogy for the way this economy is going to go under this government. But then again, you may ask, well, my colleague Kelvin Davis would ask, how could that be? Because they're going to mine Schedule 4 land, which is our prime tourist competitive advantage. So I don't know what the hell we're going to end up with. But what I do know, Mr. Speaker, is this is a good bill. I support it and I commend it to the House. Thank you very much.
I call Louise Upston.